3 days before Thanksgiving, my daughter called and said 6 words that rearranged everything I thought I understood about being a father. "Dad, Gavin thinks it's best you don't come." I was standing in my kitchen in Fredericton, New Brunswick, watching the St. John River through the window. The water was iron gray that afternoon, the way it gets in mid-November when the cold has finally settled in for good. I'd been heating up leftover soup. I remember that. I turned off the burner and stood very still and listened to the silence on the line after those words. I was 63 years old. I had spent 38 years being a father to that girl. I taught her to skate on the frozen pond behind my parents' house in Moncton. I drove her to every volleyball tournament from Fredericton to Halifax. I helped her move into residence at UNB, carried boxes up 4 flights of stairs, and pretended not to cry in the parking lot after I left. I paid for her wedding. I danced with her at the reception and whispered into her hair that I was proud of her, and I meant every syllable. And now her husband had decided I was best left out of Thanksgiving dinner. "Gavin thinks it's best," I repeated. "Not you?" She was quiet for a moment. "Dad, you know things have been tense since Easter." What happened at Easter was this. Gavin had made a comment at the dinner table about the housing market in Toronto, something dismissive about people who had chosen to stay in the Maritimes, as though we had simply failed to be ambitious. I'd said, calmly and without heat, that some people valued different things. That was all. I hadn't raised my voice. I hadn't insulted him. I had simply declined to agree with him, and he had gone cold for the rest of the weekend. "I'm your father," I said to my daughter. "I haven't seen you since the summer. I want to spend Thanksgiving with my family." "I know, Dad, I know. It's just, with his parents coming up from Mississauga, and the condo isn't very big, and Gavin feels like..." "Like what?" She lowered her voice. "Not much, just enough. Like you two don't really get along." I didn't say anything for a moment. Outside, the river moved past, gray and slow and indifferent. "Okay," I said finally. She sounded almost relieved, which was the part that hurt the most. So I spent Thanksgiving alone for the first time in my adult life. I thought about driving to Moncton to see my brother, but he had his own family chaos that year. Grandchildren everywhere, his wife recovering from a knee replacement, and I didn't want to show up as someone to be accommodated. I wasn't ready for that. Instead, I went to a place downtown called The Anchor, a pub that stays open on holidays because the owner, a man named Tim who I'd met exactly twice, understood that some people need somewhere to go. I ordered the turkey special because that felt like the right kind of stubbornness. The pub was half full, mostly single men my age and a few younger people who looked like they were from somewhere else and hadn't yet figured out where to belong in this city. The food was fine. I ate it without tasting it. A woman at the next table caught my eye somewhere around the second half of my meal. She was in her early 60s, I guessed, sitting with a man about the same age. They were sharing a plate of appetizers and a bottle of wine and talking in the easy, overlapping way of people who have been talking to each other for decades. The woman had silver hair cut short and bright brown eyes and an expression that reminded me of my mother, the kind of face that notices things. "You doing all right?" she asked. Just like that, straight across the space between us. No preamble. "Honestly," I said. "Not particularly," she smiled. "Yous neither. Our kids are in Vancouver and Edmonton this year. Too far to travel, turkey gets dry on the plane. You know how it is." She paused. "I'm Bev. This is my husband Ted." Ted raised his wine glass. He had a quiet face and an easy manner, the kind of man who takes up exactly the amount of space he needs and no more. "Peter," I said. "Join us, Peter," Bev said. It wasn't a question exactly. It was something warmer than a question. There's no point in all 3 of us eating alone in the same room. I almost didn't. I almost said I was fine, thank you. Enjoy your evening. I almost retreated back into the careful self-sufficiency I had built up over the 12 years since my divorce. But something in the directness of Bev's invitation stopped me. She wasn't offering pity. She was offering company, which is a different thing entirely. "All right," I said. "Thank you." I moved my plate to their table, and that decision turned out to be one of the most important I have ever made. We talked for nearly 3 hours. Ted had spent his career as a high school vice principal in Fredericton before retiring. Bev had been a family physician for 30 years and had recently transitioned into part-time locum work. Their children, a son in Vancouver, a daughter in Edmonton, were scattered in the way that so many maritime children are, pulled westward by economies and opportunities and the persistent idea that the real Canada is somewhere else. "Do you have kids?" Bev asked me at some point. I told them about my daughter, about Easter, about the phone call 3 days ago. Ted listened without interrupting. When I finished, he nodded slowly. "That's hard," he said. "Nothing more than that. No advice, no silver lining, no suggestions about what I should have done differently. Just acknowledgement. It was exactly what I needed." When the bill came, Ted picked it up before I could. "Don't argue," he said. "You can get it next time." And then he slid a piece of paper across the table with their address on it. Bev had already written it out, I noticed, which meant she'd intended to do this before I'd even agreed to join them. "Sunday dinners," she said. "We do them every week. Holdover from when the kids were young and we needed a fixed point in the week. We kept the habit. Come this Sunday. Come every Sunday if you want." I drove home through the dark Fredericton streets with the paper in my coat pocket and something in my chest that I hadn't felt in a while. Not happiness, exactly. Something quieter. The possibility of it. The first Sunday dinner at Ted and Bev's house was on a street in the north end of the city, in a house that had been added to gradually over the years. A sunroom here, a mudroom there, in the way of houses where the owners intend to stay. There were books everywhere, and mismatched mugs, and a dog named Biscuit who greeted me at the door, as though my arrival was the event he had been waiting for all week. Ted handed me a beer almost immediately and put me to work peeling potatoes, which I appreciated. There is something about being given a task that makes you feel less like a guest and more like a person who belongs somewhere. Their son Corey was in Vancouver, as I knew, but their daughter Teresa lived in Oromocto, about 20 minutes from the city, and she arrived that first Sunday with her husband Joel and their 2 kids, a girl named Abby, who was 10, and a boy named Sam, who was 7 and deeply interested in hockey statistics, in the way that only 7-year-old boys in New Brunswick can be. Sam explained to me over dinner, with great seriousness, the relative merits of the Canadiens versus the Maple Leafs. I told him I'd grown up cheering for the Canadiens with my father, and he looked at me with new respect, as though I had produced a credential he hadn't expected. By the time dinner was over, I had answered 14 questions about hockey, helped Abby with a word she couldn't remember for a school assignment, and listened to Ted describe, at length and with great affection, his absolute failure at maintaining the backyard vegetable garden that Bev had planted. "He killed the tomatoes," Bev said, "even the robust ones." "I don't see why vegetables should require so much attention," Ted said. They had this argument with the comfortable ease of a routine they both enjoyed. I drove home at 9 that night and realized I had gone 4 hours without thinking about the phone call. I went back the next Sunday, and the one after that. My daughter didn't call on my birthday in January. I know because I checked my phone more often than I would like to admit. I sent my grandson a card for Christmas. Her son, Oliver, who was 4, who I had held in the hospital the day he was born, and wept in the car afterward because the love of it was so overwhelming, and received a brief acknowledgement text from my daughter 2 weeks later. I called once in February. She said she was busy and would call back. She didn't. The silence was not clean. Silence never is. It sits with you at the kitchen table in the morning. It rides in the passenger seat when you're driving to the grocery store. It's the last thing you think about before you fall asleep, and the first thing that returns when you wake up. But something was different now, because the silence existed alongside something else. On Sundays, there was dinner. There was Bev asking after my week, with the focused attention of someone who has spent decades listening to people describe their symptoms and genuinely wants to understand what they're feeling. There was Ted and his dry commentary and his slow laugh and his solid, unpretentious presence. There was Sam demonstrating his current theory about defensive zone coverage, and Abby showing me her drawings, and Biscuit asleep across my feet like he had forgotten I hadn't always been there. I could be wanted somewhere without having to earn it. That was the thing I was learning. That was the thing I hadn't known I didn't know. About 16 months after that first Thanksgiving, I arrived at Ted and Bev's on a Sunday afternoon to find Ted sitting at the kitchen table alone. The house was quiet, no smells of cooking. Biscuit was lying under the table with his chin on his paws in a way that suggested the mood of the room. "Where's Bev?" I asked. "Doctor's appointment this week," Ted said. His voice was careful. "Came back with some results we weren't expecting. She's resting, he told me then. Breast cancer. Caught early, the doctors said, which was the phrase designed to make everything sound manageable, though Ted's face told me the more complicated story underneath it. I sat down across from him at the table, where I had eaten maybe 60 Sunday dinners by that point, and I just stayed there. I didn't try to reassure him, or find the right words or fix anything. I stayed, and after a while Bev came downstairs in her dressing gown and sat with us, and the three of us drank tea and didn't talk much, and that seemed to be what was needed. Bev went through treatment over the following months. I learned what days were harder, which was usually the 2 days after each session, and I made sure those were days I called or stopped by. I started doing their grocery runs on Thursdays, so Bev didn't have to manage it when she was tired. I cleaned out their eavesdrews in October because Ted's knee had been giving him trouble and he couldn't manage the ladder safely. You don't have to do all this, Bev told me one afternoon. I know, I said. I want to. She looked at me for a moment. Peter, don't let it go too long. With your daughter, time has a way of. She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't need to. I thought about what she'd said for weeks afterward. I thought about Oliver growing up without knowing me. I thought about my daughter's face at her wedding, the way she'd laughed at something I'd said during the first dance, the ease between us that I had always assumed was permanent. I thought about calling. I didn't call. The fear of being told again that I was best left out kept me from it. I had learned to live alongside the loss, but I hadn't learned to risk it again yet. Then, about 2 years after that Thanksgiving, my phone rang on a Wednesday afternoon while I was shoveling the walk. It was my daughter. Dad. Her voice was different, thinner. Can we talk? I stopped shoveling. I stood in the cold with my coat open and waited, and part of me waited for the thing I had never stopped hoping she would say, that she missed me, that she was sorry, that she understood now what she had done. Gavin and I have been having some problems. Financial problems. The condo. We bought at the peak of the market and the mortgage renewal came in a lot higher than we expected, and there's some credit card debt that got out of hand, and she stopped. Dad, we need help. We need $60,000. $60,000. I had a pension and a modest RRSP. I had the equity in my house. I was not poor, but I was not wealthy either, and $60,000 was not a thing I could simply write a check for without consequences to my own retirement. Sarah, I said, and then I stopped, because I had used her name by accident out loud. I had been calling her my daughter in my own head for 2 years, a way of keeping a distance from the specific person who had told me not to come to Thanksgiving. But standing in the snow with a shovel in my hands, she was Sarah again, and that made it worse. When did we last talk? I asked. Before today. Silence. Do you know what I did for Thanksgiving this year, and the one before that? Dad, Bev and Ted Haskell had me over. Every Sunday for 2 years. Bev had cancer and I brought her groceries on Thursdays, and I cleaned their eavesdrews because Ted's knee is bad. They are my family now, Sarah. Not because they have to be, because they chose to be. I stopped and took a breath. The cold air came in hard. You didn't call on my birthday. You didn't call on Father's Day. You sent a text when I sent Oliver a Christmas gift, and I have not seen my grandson in almost 2 years. That's not fair. Things with Gavin. I know what things with Gavin are. He doesn't want me around because I disagreed with him at Easter dinner, and you let that be enough reason. Her voice sharpened. You don't understand what my marriage is like. You never did. You were never there. I was always there. I was at every tournament and every graduation, and your wedding and the hospital when Oliver was born. I have been there for every moment that you allowed me to be part of, and then your husband decided I was inconvenient, and you agreed with him, and I spent Thanksgiving alone because of it. She was crying now. I knew her crying. I knew every register of it from 38 years of being her father. I can't give you $60,000, I said. Not like this. Not when the last 2 years have been silence, and the reason you're calling now is because you need something from me. So you're choosing strangers over your own daughter? That's what this is? I'm choosing people who have shown me that I matter to them. That's different. She said something then that I won't repeat in full. The meaning of it was that I was selfish, that Gavin had warned her about this, that she should have listened. She said not to call her. She said she'd manage on her own. The line went dead. I stood in my driveway in the snow for a long time after. That evening I drove to Ted and Bev's without being asked. Ted opened the door, looked at my face, and stepped aside without a word. Bev was in the kitchen, and she heard the door and called out, "Peter, I made too much stew again. You'll have to help us with it." I sat at their kitchen table and I told them everything. They listened the way they always did, completely, without preparing their responses while I was still talking. When I finished, Bev was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "You did the right thing. I mean that. It doesn't feel right. It rarely does," Ted said. "But you can't keep making yourself smaller to fit inside someone else's idea of what's convenient. That's not love. That's just accommodation." He was right. I had spent years accommodating myself into invisibility, and I had been so careful about it, so patient, that I hadn't even noticed it happening until I was sitting alone in a pub on Thanksgiving wondering how I'd become unnecessary. 5 years went by. I know that sounds like a long time to say so simply. It was. Bev finished treatment and got the all clear, and the celebration at the Sunday dinner that week was the best one I can remember. Corey came home from Vancouver for a visit, and we watched the playoffs together, which is a sacred activity in this province. Abby started high school. Sam made his rep hockey team and wore the jersey to Sunday dinner 3 weeks in a row. I retired from my engineering position at the city and started doing contract work for a small infrastructure firm that needed someone who knew the old water systems. I was good at it, and I liked the flexibility. I thought about my daughter often. I thought about Oliver growing up not knowing who I was. I followed her on social media briefly, before deciding it was doing me no good and stopping. I knew from a mutual friend that she and Gavin were still together, that they had moved to a bigger place in Toronto's East End, that Oliver was in school now and apparently doing well. I sent him a birthday card every year. I never got a response. Then, on a Tuesday morning in early April, my phone rang with a number I didn't recognize. "Is this Peter Callaway?" A man's voice. Professional. Measured. "Yes. Mr. Callaway, my name is Dr. Anand. I'm calling from St. Michael's Hospital in Toronto. Your daughter, Sarah Callaway Marsh, is a patient here. She listed you as her emergency contact. There's been an accident." I was in my car within 4 minutes. I called Ted from the highway. He said he and Bev would handle Bitskit, and they would call me in an hour to check in. I told him he didn't need to do that. He said, "Peter, we're going to call you in an hour. Drive carefully." The flight from Fredericton to Toronto took 2 hours and 20 minutes. It felt like a different kind of time entirely. A car had run a red light on a wet April morning. My daughter had been on her way to drop Oliver at school. Oliver was fine. He'd been in the back seat and the impact hit the driver's side. My daughter had a fractured pelvis, 3 broken ribs, a punctured lung, and had required emergency surgery for internal bleeding. She was stable by the time I arrived. Stable, they said, which is a word that means alive and not getting worse, which is not the same as fine. Gavin was in the waiting room. We looked at each other across it. He looked terrible, which I noted without satisfaction. He nodded at me. I nodded back. That was all we had. Oliver was there too, sitting in one of those gray hospital chairs with a coloring book open on his lap that he wasn't coloring in. He was 6 now. I had last seen him when he was 4 years old, and children change so entirely in 2 years that he was almost a stranger, except that he had his mother's eyes and his grandmother's coloring, and he looked up at me with an expression that was trying very hard to be brave. "Are you Grandpa?" he asked. The question hit me somewhere I hadn't expected. "I am," I said. "Mom has a picture of you," he said, "in her drawer. She looks at it sometimes." I sat down next to him. I asked him about the coloring book. He explained that he was coloring a dinosaur, but he wasn't sure what color dinosaurs actually were, and it was bothering him. I told him that scientists weren't entirely sure either, which seemed to ease the pressure somewhat. We spent the next 40 minutes coloring the dinosaur a collaborative blue-green that Oliver decided was probably accurate. Gavin left to make phone calls. His parents were coming up from Mississauga, he said. He didn't ask if I needed anything. Ted called at 6 o'clock as promised. I stepped into the hallway to answer. "How is she?" Bev asked. Ted had her on speaker. "Surgery went well. They're optimistica." "And how are you?" I leaned against the hospital wall. The fluorescent lights hummed. Down the corridor, a nurse was pushing a cart. "I colored a dinosaur with my grandson for 40 minutes, I said. I heard Bev's voice soften. "Oh, Peter, he's a good kid," I said. "He's a really good kid." My daughter was moved out of intensive care after 4 days. I stayed in Toronto, at a hotel 2 blocks from the hospital. Gavin's parents arrived from Mississauga and took Oliver, which was a relief for everyone. Gavin went back to work after a week, which I noted and said nothing about. His parents returned to Mississauga. Once it was clear my daughter was out of danger. She needed someone to be there. I moved into the spare room at their condo and became, temporarily, the person who managed everything. I took my daughter to physio appointments. I figured out the Toronto transit system and took Oliver to school on the days Gavin couldn't manage it. I cooked meals that were portioned to accommodate a recovering fractured pelvis. Nothing too heavy, nothing that required effort to eat. I learned what my daughter liked now, because things change in 5 years and I had missed the changing. She watched me from the couch, sometimes with an expression I couldn't read. 3 weeks into my stay, she called me into the living room one evening. Oliver was asleep. The condo was quiet in that particular way Toronto condos are quiet. The city still audible below, contained. "I can't sleep," she said. She had her mother's way of getting to the point without warning. When the car hit, I thought that was it. I thought I was going to die right there on Queen Street East. And do you know what I thought about? I sat in the chair across from her. "What?" "I thought about the last thing I said to you." Her voice was steady, but her hands weren't. "Don't call me." I said, "Don't call me." And then I thought about what it would mean if those were the last words I ever said to my father. I didn't say anything. I had imagined some version of this conversation for 5 years, and now that it was happening, I found I had no prepared speech. "I told Oliver you were busy," she said. "That's what I told him, that you were far away and busy, and I kept the picture of you because She stopped. "I don't know why. I think I couldn't stop being your daughter even when I was trying to." "You were never not my daughter," I said. "Not for one day. Gavin told me you were selfish, that you only got along with people who agreed with you, that you made everything about yourself." She looked at her hands. "I think I believed him, because it was easier than admitting that I let him push you out of my life. Because that would have meant I was the one who did that, and I couldn't look at that, Sarah. You've been here for 3 weeks, she said. You've done everything. Oliver adores you. He's been talking about the dinosaur for 2 weeks. Gavin has called maybe 6 times. His parents sent a plant." She finally looked up at me. "And you've never once said I told you so." "Not once. That was never the point," I said. "What was the point?" "You," I said. "You were always the point." She cried then, in the way of someone who has been holding something tightly for a very long time and has finally stopped. I moved to the couch and sat next to her and didn't say anything useful, because there was nothing useful to say. I was just there. I had always been just there. "I want to meet them," she said when she'd settled. "Ted and Bev. You talk about them when you think I'm asleep. I can tell I can tell they've been what I should have been. They've been friends," I said. "They're not a replacement." "I know." She looked at me. "But I want to thank them for being there when I wasn't. The first Sunday dinner that included my daughter was in June, after she was well enough to travel. I drove her to Fredericton myself. She couldn't manage the flight yet, and the drive gave us 9 hours together on the Trans-Canada, which turned out to be exactly what we needed. We talked, and we were silent, and we talked again. We stopped for coffee in Rivière-du-Loup and sat at a Tim Hortons window and watched the river for 20 minutes without saying anything, and that was fine too. I was nervous pulling into Ted and Bev's street. I didn't know how the two halves of my life would fit together. I had been holding them separate for so long. Bev answered the door before I'd knocked. I think she'd been watching from the window. She looked at my daughter standing next to me, and her face did something complicated and warm, and she said, "You must be Sarah. Come in, come in. I made your father's favorite, and there's far too much of it." The evening was what it was. My daughter was quiet at first, watching Ted and Bev with the careful attention of someone who is trying to understand a story they came into late. But Bev drew her out. She's good at that. Decades of listening to patients had given her a particular skill for it. And by dinner there was something easier between them. Abby, who was 15 by then, and possessed of a terrifying confidence, asked my daughter about her work in graphic design, and then immediately wanted to see examples on her phone. Sam argued hockey with me as usual, and pretended to be offended when I said the Canadiens still had the better historical record. Biscuit sat on my daughter's feet, which Ted said was a good sign. "He doesn't do that for everyone," Ted said. "He does it for everyone." Bev said. He's not selective, he just wants somewhere warm to sit. He's selective, Ted said. He has standards. My daughter laughed. A real one. I hadn't heard that laugh in 5 years, and I hadn't realized how much I'd missed the specific frequency of it. At the end of the evening, I watched her say something to Bev at the door. I couldn't hear it. Bev hugged her, long and firm, the way Bev hugs everyone she means it with. In the car afterward, my daughter was quiet for a long time. I understand now, she said. What? Why Sunday? Why every week, no matter what? They're not. They don't need anything from you, they just want you there. She paused. I didn't know how to do that. I want to learn. I reached over and put my hand over hers briefly. Then I turned back to the road. She filed for divorce 8 months later. I won't tell her story. It's hers to tell, except to say that the process was what those processes are, and she came through it the way I always knew she could, because she had her mother's stubbornness and my refusal to accept that a thing is finished just because it's broken. She and Oliver moved to Fredericton the following spring. The city had a growing tech sector, and she could work remotely anyway, and I think she wanted to stop being far away. Oliver is 9 now. He made me teach him to skate on the rink at Officers Square this past winter. He fell approximately 40 times and got up every time without being asked to. He has his mother's eyes and his own stubbornness, and he asks me more questions than anyone I have ever met, which I consider a high compliment. Sunday dinners now require extra chairs. My daughter brings dessert. Oliver and Sam have a complicated ongoing argument about whether the Maple Leafs will ever win another cup in our lifetimes, and the depth of feeling on both sides is impressive. Abby is in university now, studying environmental science, and she FaceTimes in when she can't make it in person. Bev and Teresa and my daughter have somehow become friends, which nobody planned and everyone is glad about, and Biscuit still sits on whoever's feet he likes best. This week it was mine. Last Thanksgiving, 5 years after that first quiet dinner at the Anchor, I sat at a table crowded with people and noise, and someone's cranberry sauce that was genuinely too sweet, and a debate about hockey that was getting somewhat heated, and I looked at my daughter across the table. She was laughing at something Bev had said. Oliver was trying to explain something to Sam using a lot of hand gestures. Ted caught my eye and raised his glass, and I raised mine. 5 years ago, I sat alone in a pub because my son-in-law thought I was best left out of Thanksgiving. I couldn't taste my food. What I know now, that I didn't know then, is that the people who leave space for you to disappear have already told you something important about themselves. And the people who pull up a chair and say, "Sit with us," there's plenty have told you something important too. You get to decide which of those things you build your life around. If you're watching this and you're somewhere quiet right now, somewhere that feels lonelier than it should, I want you to hear this. The invitation comes when you're not expecting it, from people you haven't met yet, in rooms you didn't plan to walk into. It comes from a woman with silver hair in a pub in Fredericton on a Thanksgiving when you have nowhere to be. You just have to say yes when it does. And if you're the one who hasn't called, if there's someone waiting at the other end of a phone call you keep not making, don't let Margaret's lesson be yours. Don't wait until the accident. Don't wait until the ambulance. Time does not wait to find out if you were planning to use it. It's never too late. But sometimes it almost is. Don't find out which one it is by accident. Thank you for being here. Thank you for listening. I'll see you in the next one.